We're in this place culturally around race where for the first time, white people are starting to have their behavior pathologized in a joking way to the rest of their race. You know, I think a good example of this is that like white people don't season their food is like something that is like a trope that you're seeing. And you're seeing white people really respond to this being like, hey, that I don't like this feeling. But the fact is that like there is no amount of saying white people don't season their food that will actually impact the white community as a whole. White people have had to deal with, you know, these jokes now for, a couple of decades, maybe at most.
We're really struggling, okay?
Yeah.
It's really hard.
Whereas we're sort of up against a century of these messages and these ideas around who we are as people based on our race that are really hard to dismantle.
It's Mayim Bialik's breakdown. She's gonna break it down for you, because you know she knows a thing or two. So now she's gonna break down. It's a breakdown. She's gonna break it down.
Mayim Bialik's breakdown is supported by Athletic Greens. I use Athletic Greens every day. Why did I start taking it? Because I was one of those people who was taking a million pills and powders and supplements and then forgetting to take them because I was so frustrated and I didn't want to take them because there was too many. I started using Athletic Greens because it's one delicious scoop. And in that scoop, you get 75 high-quality vitamins, minerals, whole food source superfoods, probiotics, and adaptogens. It helps me start my day off right. It supports my gut health, my nervous system, my immune system, my energy, recovery, focus, everything. AG1 is a small habit with huge benefits. It's something you can do every single day to take great care of yourself. Right now, reclaim your health and arm your immune system with convenient daily nutrition. One scoop in a cup of water every day. That's it. No need for a million different pills and supplements to look out for your health. And Athletic Greens is making it easy. They're going to give you a free 1-year supply of immune-supporting vitamin D and 5 free travel packs with your first purchase. Just go to athleticgreens.com/breakdown. Again, athleticgreens.com/breakdown. Take ownership over your health and pick up the ultimate daily nutritional insurance. Hi, I'm Mayim Bialik, and welcome to my breakdown. This is the place where we break things down so you don't have to. And today we're going to break down, well, bipolar disorder, Asian American comedians, what is race, and what do celebrities owe the public, specifically in the realm of mental illness. We're going to do all of these things with one incredible man, Joel Kim Booster. The New York Times named him one of the queer young comics redefining American humor. He wrote and starred in the Fox Searchlight rom-com Fire Island, which is loosely based on Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. And PsychoSexual is his stand-up special on Netflix, which is absolutely phenomenal. He's also on the Maya Rudolph show Loot on Apple TV+. I recommend so many things about Joel Kim Booster, but mostly I hope you will listen to this conversation, which we just found so incredible. So my partner Jonathan's not here today, so without further ado, I'm just going to go at it solo. Joel Kim Booster, welcome to The Breakdown.
Break it down.
Joel Kim Booster, welcome to The Breakdown. It is really, really nice to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
I typically embarrass myself on my podcast frequently, and I think today will be no exception. I'm a very, very big fan of yours.
Oh.
And we also obviously got to work together on Celebrity Jeopardy,
Yes.
which is its own, hilarity. But I saw it was your first comedy special, PsychoSexual.
Technically my second. I had a half-hour comedy special on Comedy Central that came out.
That is true. But your first 1 hour long comedy special. And what was the first one called?
The first one is just, it's a part of I think it's called the half hour on Comedy Central. Like,
okay, got it.
You can watch it on, I think Paramount Plus is now the only place it's accessible, but
okay.
Or YouTube even.
Right.
But yeah, it was just a part of a bunch of stand-up specials that they produced.
And when I saw PsychoSexual, I've actually watched it twice and likely will watch it again. And I have a 14 and 17-year-old, both boys, and I'm eager for my 17-year-old to be ready to watch Psychosexual. I mean, I think he would say that he's ready, but I think I might give it another 6 months or so.
Yeah.
Which is not to say that there's I don't like the word inappropriate when talking about comedy, because I don't like to use that word, but it definitely is. It's mature. I think some of its content.
Yeah, I just think it's not even so much inappropriate. I just don't know that he'll be able to relate to a lot of the stuff quite yet, and it's more, that's more the factor than it being inappropriate, I think.
Right. The other reason that I was kind of instantly really taken with you when I saw that special, and I didn't really know much else about you, to be honest. I was really taken with the complexity of your humor, meaning it's very, very funny. And if you like, if you're a person who likes absurdist comedy, if you're a person who likes interesting observations that are, I want to say intellectually grounded, in that you have a very, very astute intellectual lens with which you view your world. But there's a level of complexity to the analysis that you do as you tell the stories that you tell and the way that you tell them. And you do something which, on a first glance in Psychosexual, might be seen as a shtick. And you call out, you isolate, you playfully isolate a member of the audience who is a straight man. And you basically, you weave this really beautiful thread through kind of the rest of the special, from the time that you identify him. I shouldn't say isolate, you identify him. And what happens is it's an opportunity to laugh a lot. And that is something I think that as a comedian, you absolutely achieve. You give people a lot of reason to laugh. However, there's a level of what you are confronting people with this thread that you weave throughout that I found extremely powerful and really important for the culture that we're living in. This notion of who speaks for what and who speaks for whom. And as we're going to talk about, you live at the intersection of so many aspects of Western culture and, the melting pot that is the United States. It makes so much sense to me once I learned more about you and have gotten to know a bit more about you, the intentionality there. When you set out to do and write Psychosexual, did you have this larger idea of like, I want to say something deeper, but also hide it in all of this laughter?
No, I mean, so the special, really, the genesis of it came from a lot of different places. And I think part of it was I was at a real crossroads with stand-up when I started writing this special, because I had I did the Comedy Central half hour in 2016, and then between 2016 and 2019, I was rebuilding, and I was sort of writing what would become my first hour special. And I remember it must have been 2018 or early 2019, we had started to send that hour out to networks to try and sell it as a special, and we just got a flurry of rejections back. Like, nobody wanted to buy the hour that I had. And I was really frustrated with it. And I sort of went back to the drawing board in 2019, and I was in Toronto, and I just didn't know why the special, the hour, wasn't working. And I realized sort of in that moment when I was in Toronto that it was basically a really good sort of hour of jokes, but there was no connective tissue for it. And in a moment of frustration in Toronto, I literally did what would become the framing device of the special, which is I found a straight guy in the audience, and I was like, hey, you're a straight guy. You guys are the ones who are making most of the decisions about what gets seen in stand-up comedy. Let's talk about my set. And so I rearranged the set, and I rearranged it in the three sort of acts that it's broken into in the special. And after each act, I would just sort of find a straight guy and really interrogate him about, what he thought was working and what he thought was relatable, because that's a word that I had heard a lot. And and then tried to, and then it sort of coalesced from there. And the other thing is that I spent a lot of time abroad doing stand-up in Melbourne. And over there's a lot of comedians from the UK who work the festival circuit there, and Australians, and they write a new hour of stand-up every year.
Wow.
And they look at, and the tradition is much more connected to theater over there than I think it is over here. And so a lot of their shows have a point, and I think like that's why, like, you saw it when Hannah Gatsby released Nanette. I think a lot of people were sort of they didn't know how to process it as a stand-up special, because it was in parts quite serious, and it did sort of tie itself together in a point at the end. And to me, when I watched that, having seen so much stand-up from the UK, I was like, oh, this is just how they do it over there. And I think for a lot of people didn't know how to process that as a stand-up special. And so between those two things, that's sort of where the special came from, was this like trying to sort of ape the traditions of stand-up from the UK, and then also that moment of frustration trying to rebuild that set, and just finding it really interesting. I mean, crowd work has always been a huge part of my stand-up, and this was just sort of taking it to the next level and sort of really interrogating somebody, not just about like their life, but really involving them in my set.
Well, and so, my question was like, did you realize when you kind of set out to do this, the deeper implications? And, your initial response was like, no, not really. But the fact is, it feels like a little bit yes. Not that you were looking to be like, I'm going to make a statement, but to say like, there's something about the structure of what you do and the way that you can present it that has this opportunity for like these other layers. And that's, I guess, what, me as a viewer and a fan gets to look back and say like, wow, this is a really, really, it's a masterful crafting, of what otherwise would be a fantastic hour, of hilarious comedy. Before we kind of get into a little bit of your background, I do wonder the crowd work aspect. You're one of those people who, in your stage persona, because obviously you have another persona, which is also you. But when I see you interacting with a crowd, there's a certain amount of healthy fear that I have if you were to talk to me in a crowd. And, I think when any comedian singles someone out, I go to a lot of Eliza Schlesinger's shows, there's a definite kind of playfulness, but there's a pointedness to the way that you speak and the way you put words together. Like it comes so quick to you, the kind of the banter. Mm-hmm. And I wonder, is that something that you always had honed? Because I think about it also in terms of, what we talk about here is mental health. We talk about the way that we form words and relationships. And I wonder, was this like a feature of you? Were you always like quick with a word and quick with a comeback? Because it is such an important part of psychosexual.
Yeah. I mean, I have always been pretty quick on my feet in terms of that. But I will say, with regard to the crowd work that I do, especially as you see it in the special, is that I don't want to take away some of the magic, but it is practice. It is a bit like close-up magic, where the secret is to make them think that they are in control, when in fact I've done it so many times. I've asked these questions so many times. I've navigated these conversations by the time I filmed the special so many times that there's like sort of a branching choose your own adventure tree going on in my head, where it's like, I've asked the same question so many times. I know exactly the 3 responses that I will get no matter what. And from those, and so I know I have like a bank of responses to sort of control the conversation from there. And so it is a little bit, the secret of it is to make it seem really scary and
it feels
spontaneous
very
in the moment, when in fact I feel very much in control by the time I shot the special, because I had done it so many times.
Now I feel like I learned the magic trick, and now I have to go back and watch it with that in mind. Mayim Bialik's breakdown is supported by Betterhelp. I've found that when I'm at my best, I can do my best at things, but sometimes life gets us down. I often feel overwhelmed. I feel burnt out. I'm not showing up the way I want to. I snap at Jonathan. That's not a good thing. But working with a therapist does help me get closer to the best version of me. And it's something I work at all the time. When you feel empowered by knowing that you're bringing the best you to the table, you're more prepared to take on what life throws at you. If you're thinking of giving therapy a try, I cannot recommend it highly enough. Betterhelp is a great option. It's entirely online, convenient, flexible, affordable. You just fill out a questionnaire, you're matched with a licensed therapist. You can switch at any time for no additional charge if it's not a good match. Live a more empowered life, and therapy will get you there. Visit betterhelp.com/break today. Get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/break.
Mayim Bialik's Breakdown is supported by Rocket Money.
The average person has around 12 paid subscriptions. Think about that. If you think you're only subscribed to a handful of services, you might want to double check. With Rocket Money, you can quickly identify and cancel all of your unwanted subscriptions. Rocket Money, formerly known as Truebill, is a personal finance app that finds and cancels your unwanted subscriptions, monitors your spending, and helps you lower your bills all in one place. Over 80% of people have subscriptions that they forgot about, like that streaming service that you bought to watch just that one show on, that's me, or that free trial that you never even used, also me. Rocket Money will quickly and easily identify your subscriptions for you so you can stop paying for the ones you don't want. You just find the subscription you don't want and you press cancel, and Rocket Money will cancel it for you. No more long hold times with customer service, no more tedious emailing back and forth. Rocket Money makes canceling subscriptions as easy as a click of a button. Over 3 million people have used Rocket Money, saving the average person up to $720 a year.
Stop throwing money away, cancel unwanted subscriptions, and manage your expenses the easy way by going to rocketmoney.com/breakdown. That's
rocketmoney.com/breakdown.
rocketmoney.com/breakdown.
That's a great place to kind of jump off from and go back, because a lot of your story has a lot of these kind of twists and turns. And, you know, your bio it's just one of the most interesting. I'm sorry, I hate to say it. It's just such an incredibly interesting story. You're younger than I am, but you know, I grew up in Los Angeles. I went to public school my whole life, where I was mostly one of the only white kids in a lot of my classes. Most of the kids were immigrants from South Korea or from Central America or from Mexico, and you know, I also grew up with, you know, a generation of families that began adoptions from, among other places, from South Korea. And I think one of your quotes was, you thought that every white family had an Asian child. But for people who don't know, tell us kind of your origin story, as it were.
Yeah, so I was adopted when I was about 3 months old from Jeju, South Korea, which is a little island off the coast, and it is known for it's really fascinating. Actually, I found this out as an adult. Jeju is known in the region for being one of the only places in Asia that had for many centuries a matriarchal power structure. Wow. On the island, because women drove the economy. They were called Hanyeo, which is it means sea woman, and these women would free dive without equipment for minutes at a time, collect these pearls, and the men would stay at home and sort of make the house, and that's how it worked for a while. And they still exist. I think their numbers are quite dwindled now. I think it's somewhere in there. There's like 60 of them left in Jeju. Jeju is now largely a tourist sort of trap in Korea, but it's still quite beautiful. And I was adopted when I was about 3 months old. From there, I grew up in the suburbs of Chicago with my family, who it was an eclectic sort of situation. My mom's side of the family, a lot of them live in the South. And so we were the only ones in Chicago, and they were very, very deeply religious people. So because of that, we were homeschooled until I was a junior in high school, at which point I had been begging to go to public school pretty much my entire life because I was a fairly social creature and I really wanted to be around people. And finally, I sort of broke them down after years of asking, and they sent me to public school. And at which point, after about a month of being at public school, I came out of the closet, smoked weed for the first time, drank for the first time, hooked up with a guy for the first time. Pretty much everything they feared would happen when sending me to public school happened within the span of about a month. And then flash forward a year after that, they read my journal in which I detailed a lot of these events and happenings, and they discovered, this sort of double life that I was living at school. And it was a really tumultuous time. They did not handle it well. I did not handle it well. I ended up moving out of my house when I was a senior in high school and sort of living with friends, and didn't talk to them again until I was really pretty much in college. At which point we did end up reconciling in college, and things are much better now. Still not completely perfect, as they are still deeply religious and very much conservative people.
Mm-hmm.
I think Celebrity Jeopardy might be the first thing my mom has ever seen me do on
Wow.
TV. And so, yeah, that was a big moment for us. And and that's sort of where I am at now.
Okay, so I mean that's so much. So just to clarify, because I don't know if you explicitly said your family was not, you were not adopted into a South Korean family, you were
No.
not adopted into an Asian family, you were adopted into a white
Yes.
white Anglo-Saxon, as it were,
Yeah.
Protestant family. And you don't have to say the denomination, but was it just
Baptist.
standard? Oh, Baptist. Okay, great.
Baptist, yeah.
How many siblings did you grow up with?
I have two siblings. I have an older brother and an older sister. They're both biological to my parents, and then
Got it.
I was sort of bonus baby at the end of the day, and like you sort of alluded to this, but in the late 80s, early 90s, like Korea was the spot
Mhm.
to internationally adopt, and I talk about this in my first special, but Korea, it was like the Uber Eats of babies, because it was the only place internationally where you didn't have to fly to the country to pick up the baby. They would
Wow.
deliver the baby to you at the airport. And so that convenience, I think if you grew up around the same time that we grew up,
Yes.
that's why you see a lot of Korean adoptees. That's changed now. But it was, and there's actually, and the more you dig into it, it is kind of dark. There's a lot of problems, I think, with the sort of transracial adoption, international adoption industry, basically, from that time,
Yes.
because there was a lot of coercion going on in South Korea, and a lot
Sure.
of separating of families that maybe necessarily I don't think we like to think about. I think for most people the fantasy is that like they had too many kids, they couldn't take care of them, and so they adopted one of them out, and I think that is like a really positive idea of what was happening, and the likelihood of that happening for all of those babies is very low. But my parents probably had no idea.
Sure.
They just wanted to adopt a baby, and there I was.
This is just a totally satellite question. Do you, I don't know what your kind of spiritual or kind of holistic view of the universe is. Do you have any sort of attachment to what those months of your life were like? Some people believe cellularly we hold on to information. I'm just curious if that's something you've ever explored.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's definitely something that we've unpacked in therapy,
Okay.
which I'm a big advocate and fan of. I think that there is like a trauma. I was very young when I was adopted. Likely did not spend a lot of time with my birth mother after birth, and I think that it's not the only thing that developmentally affects your personality and attachment, I think. But I'm a very anxiously attached person, and I think that that has always been true. That's been true for as long as I can remember, and I think it's not. It seems unlikely that my separation from my birth mother very early on doesn't have anything to do with that. It just seems like it's probably in some not so small part very much connected to who I am as an adult now. And I should say really quickly too, my parents were wonderful parents growing up. The sort of handling me coming out and all of that aside, they were really loving parents. They did a really good job of making me feel very much like a part of the family, and like never really, to the point where when I was young, because I wasn't spending a lot of time outside of my family, as you alluded to, I thought it was completely normal to be Asian in the middle of this white family. One of my earliest jokes is that I knew I was gay before I knew I was Asian, because I just didn't think about race at all, when I was growing up. I didn't think about the differences because my mom and my dad did such a great job of making me feel like I was just one of their kids, just another one of their kids. And it wasn't really until I went to a family reunion in Alabama when I was quite young, and we took like a giant composite photo of all of the cousins and all of the entire family, basically. And it wasn't until that moment when I looked around and realized I was the only Asian person in this sea of white, the Baldwin family. That was the moment where I was like, oh, something seems off here. That was sort of my journey with that.
My children were homeschooled their whole life. My 17-year-old recently did start going to school, but we do not homeschool for religious reasons per se. Many Jewish people do homeschool for religious reasons, as do Christian people. But for us, that was not our motivation. But living in Los Angeles, there are a lot of other homeschool people who are secular. There also are obviously religious homeschoolers everywhere. I think it's very interesting the way you talk about it, though, because the fact that kind of you had this desire, to be around other kids, you had this desire for sort of a larger social experience. The notion that, what your parent, I think what you said is, what your parents most feared, all happened. And obviously I think about that with my kids, with alcohol, with drugs, because they have been in a pretty insulated environment, and that's one of the reasons that a lot of people do homeschool, is to have kind of closer tabs on their kids in hopefully a positive way. But in terms of your sexual identity, I would think you agree with me that school doesn't make you gay.
No.
You were right. But I think for some, and I have very, very religious family myself. So, I've been through, I'm 47, so I've been through many decades of us learning about how to talk about homosexuality, how to understand it, and even my religious family, they've come quite a way, since the 80s, as it were, when it kind of became part of the vernacular. I remember the day Rock Hudson died. I remembered that conversation my parents had with us. Anyway, but I was curious in terms of your sexual identity and sort of what that was like. Many people talk about kind of knowing you're gay just like you're straight. The old adage of like, well, have you tried it out? It's like, no, but like most of us don't try out heterosexuality if we're heterosexuals and say like, I'm not really sure I want a prince to carry me off. It's like, it's so ingrained. And reinforced for a lot of people. Can you talk about, in kind of whatever way you think might be helpful, especially for our listeners? We have a lot of young people listening. We have a lot of people who are exploring things possibly with the support of people who choose to be public about their own experience. So, I guess what was it like, and sort of what was that coming out process like to yourself, and then, kind of to the larger world?
I mean, like you said, I knew from a very, very young age that I was attracted to men. Like as young as you can be attracted to someone. I remember telling my brother and my sister when I was 4 years old that I liked looking at naked boys, basically. And this was in response to like a Baywatch episode that we watched with like David Hasselhoff. And they laughed it off because, I was 4 and they just thought I was being silly. But really from that point on, I knew. And then you go through this phase when you're in, sort of junior high, and you sort of understand the implications of what you're feeling, especially in the backdrop of being in a very, very evangelical conservative house and church. You try and suppress it. And I would pray every night, to not be the way I was. And then it wasn't until I was in public school when I was around people that were, not as religious or completely secular, and had the opportunity to be accepted by people who, really wanted to meet me on my terms and didn't, ask me to, bend to fit their idea of what a good Christian was or a good person was, that I felt comfortable enough coming out. And it happened very quickly because I was involved in like theater and choir and the arts and stuff like that in high school. That's really why I wanted to go to high school, was to experience the arts. And it was really there that I found people that, for the first time in my life really accepted me for who I was. And that's, I think like we take it for granted now, in a lot of ways, because we are living in a time of greater acceptance for being gay. But at the time, like, that is why there's like such a deep ingrained love of like the arts, and why I think it's so important is because I do think it attracts people who are accepting and who want to, meet people where they are in ways that, without that I think that art fosters in people. I think like that understanding of different life experiences comes from is really fostered in the arts, and that's why I think it's so important and to this day.
Yeah. Your story includes, treatment, I think initially. And, this is something that many of us know about from the past, many of us know about it kind of documented from the 50s, the 1950s and the 1960s. And obviously it continued, this notion that there's first of all, something to fix about individuals who are gay, and then that there is some sort of, the assumption that there's a scientific method by which to reverse this, which is also, a fallacy. What was that experience? And, you don't have to go into tremendous detail. I hope I'm not looking for drama here, but I think there's some value to maybe if you could share a little bit about what that process was like for you to say, no, I don't want to or need to be fixed.
Yeah, so I think what you're alluding to is when my parents found out I was gay, there was a lot of tumult, and there was, and what I alluded to is I didn't handle it very well either. I had sort of an emotional breakdown when my parents confronted me about this. And so they sent me to an inpatient mental hospital for teens. Which was really known in my community at the time as like the place where, like, if you tried to commit suicide, that's where you would go. And when I was sent there, I also met kids who had like literally tried to, murder their parents or things like that. Like, it was a really intense place. And so a lot of things were going on. My parents, I think, conflated my sort of instability with the gayness. And so they sent me there in the hopes that like I would change. And I think I got there, and almost immediately the people that worked there, this was a secular facility. They knew that like there was something else going on. Like it was like sort of like it was not like, it was definitely the wrong place for me to be. But I think also the people that worked there understood that I was struggling with no small amount of like mental turmoil after a lifetime, my entire life growing up in this environment and hating this big part of myself, and understanding that like I did need help, but this wasn't the place to get it. And my parents were fairly anti, secular therapy or secular psychological help. And so I didn't, really go to a real therapist until I was in college. I was going to see a lot of like pastors and Christian therapists and things like that were really, the treatment was largely prayer based, which was not super helpful for me as an adolescent. And, it was like the first time in my life going to that facility where I talked to people about the possibility of mental illness. And it is one of those things now. Like, I was diagnosed bipolar when I was in my early 30s. And it was one of those things. The diagnosis, it's upsetting. It's not something you want to hear, but it did also at the same time really reframe a lot of my experiences growing up and as a younger adolescent and as a young adult. And I found it very helpful because it was like putting words to feelings that I didn't know how to manage as a young adult and as a someone in my 20s. And so it really recolored a lot of those experiences, specifically that one instance when I came out and really had like my first sort of like true meltdown, breakdown, that would go on to sort of I would re-experience moments like that throughout my life. And I didn't ever really know why or how or to deal with it.
Mayim Bialik's Breakdown is supported by Apollo.
Apollo is a new wearable that helps you sleep more and stress less. Apollo Neuro's proven technology helps calm your nerves and clear your mind, melting away stress so that you can try and get some sleep. It's like a wearable hug for the nervous system, using touch therapy to help you wind down into a restful state without drugs and without side effects. You can wear it on the wrist, that's where I like to wear it, ankle, or as a clip attached to your clothing. People will say, what's that new accessory? It's Apollo. Apollo delivers silent, soothing vibrations that help you fall asleep and stay asleep. The Apollo wearable supports your natural circadian rhythms and helps you become more consistent with your wake up and bedtime every day, which, as Jonathan has taught us, is a hugely important part of feeling rested and really being at your best. According to a recent sleep study, consistent Apollo wearable users gained an extra 30 minutes of high quality sleep per night. That is huge. The Apollo wearable works without side effects and safe for adults and children alike. Get $40 off your Apollo today at apolloneuro.com/breakdown.
If you're using the landing page, the $40 automatically applies. If not, the discount code is breakdown40 for $40 off. Mayim Bialik's Breakdown is supported by Third Love.
Jonathan, I have a very serious question for you. It's about bras. What if there was a bra that made me look and feel amazing and was actually super comfortable all day? What if that existed?
All of your serious questions are usually about bras.
Well, most bras suck, and it's a real bummer. Third Love knows it's not you, it's your bra. Third Love spent years designing bras for your body. They make over 60 sizes. I didn't even know there could be 60 sizes of bras, but they make over 60 sizes, and they even invented half cups, so you always get the perfect fit, which means you will always look and feel great. I didn't know I was a half cup until Third Love. I'm a half cup, and it makes a huge difference. Ditch your bad bras. Get a better one that makes you look and feel great. Upgrade your bra and get 20% off your first order at thirdlove.com/breakdown. That's 20% off your first order today at thirdlove.com/breakdown.
Mayim Bialik's Breakdown is supported by Zocdoc. If you're like me, you've got like that health problem that you're not taking care of, and you're about to like text all your friends in a group chat to say like, what do I do? You're unlikely to find quality medical advice in your group chat, I promise, but you can find it on Zocdoc from a doctor. Thousands of medical professionals on Zocdoc are there to help you. They listen like a friend and give you the expert care you need. Zocdoc is the only free app that lets you find and book doctors who are patient-reviewed, take your insurance, are available when you need them, and treat any condition under the sun. No more doctor roulette. No more looking for reviews that are questionable on the internet. With Zocdoc, it's a trusted guide to connect you to your favorite doctor that you haven't met yet. Millions of people use Zocdoc's free app to find and book a doctor in their neighborhood who's patient-reviewed and fits their needs and their schedule just right. Go to Zocdoc.com/breakdown, download the Zocdoc app for free, then find and book a top-rated doctor today. Many are available within 24 hours. That's ZocDoc.com/breakdown, Zocdoc.com/breakdown.
We've talked a lot about bipolar disorder on this podcast, but I think it's really important for people to hear that sometimes even into our 20s and 30s, even in this era, it can be very hard to pin down what is essentially a spectrum of chemicals that sometimes fall neatly into a category and sometimes don't.
Yeah.
So some people will look very, very textbook bipolar 1 or very, very textbook bipolar 2. Some people will have a mixture. Some people will have mixed episodes. Some people will have different features of a disorder at different points in their life, depending on hormones, depending on relationship status, depending on, so many things. Just like people during the pandemic and really throughout COVID have seen a spike in anxiety and in this kind of, anticipatory anxiety. Those things are also dependent on our culture and what's going on. Obviously, depression is one pole. Did you experience mania? Were you aware of hypomania, or did you have extreme mania? What was that like?
So that's the interesting thing about my diagnosis is that I would say for most of my life, I really mania was sort of how my bipolar manifested, hypomania mostly.
Got it.
And like I was never depressed, and that's why I think it was really difficult for me to find what was going on in my life mentally, because depression is something I think that is talked about quite frequently, at least like in the time that I was coming up in my 20s and 30s. Like, everyone I knew was on Lexapro, and I tried it, and it didn't really work for me, because depression wasn't the main sort of way my bipolar manifested. It was mostly in mania. Like, the reason I was diagnosed was because I was on a very short-lived NBC sitcom in 2019 called Sunnyside. And right before we went into production, I had an actual manic episode where I tried to quit the show before we even started filming. And it was at that point like the biggest opportunity in my career that had ever come along. And like no one in my life understood what was going on. No one understood why I was doing this. And that was really a wake-up call moment where I was like, okay, I actually need to talk about what this means. And it wasn't, as you alluded to, it wasn't until the pandemic, it wasn't until lockdown that depression became like another sort of thing that I had to really focus on, because and it was really frustrating too, because it was really hard to pinpoint, because hypomania especially I was so productive. And as a person
Yep.
who's very social as well, like I was always, it's really hard for a lot of people to pinpoint that as a problem sometimes, because when I was hypomanic, I was funny, I was charismatic, I was,
My garage has never been cleaner than when I was in a hypomanic episode.
I wrote some of the best things I've ever written while I was hypomanic. And so it's a hard thing to let go of when you start treating it. We don't talk about that a lot either, where it's like, I went into treatment and before, in the beginning stages of it, you miss that mania a little bit, because, and I struggled a lot with whether or not my medication was dampening my creative ability, or suppressing a part of myself that I felt was very sort of core to who I was, and it's scary. And obviously now that I've sort of, gone through the process of figuring out what the right medication is and the right cocktail of medication is and the dosages and things like that, I'm a much happier person, I think, just like living in stability for the most part. But you do sort of, and I think it is part of the trick of the disease, that like you sort of grow to really appreciate and love certain parts of yourself when you're manic, and it's scary to let go of that.
The way that you just described it, I don't think I've heard, a better description of hypomania in particular. And I think it is, it's something that doesn't get as much buzz as, quote, proper mania, right?
Yeah.
The bipolar one, which is like these very, very severe and debilitating swings between, when we think of mania, we often think of like, people maxing out credit cards or like having sex with strangers in cars, which if that's the thing that you do normally, no insult, but meaning what we call kind of out of character, sexual behavior, out of character, financial behavior. The thing about hypomania, and this has, been my experience, is you do get the pressured speech, you get the racing thoughts, you get the thoughts that are coming faster than you can write them down. It's a very bubbly, overflowing, kind of effervescent, feeling. But I do also know that the notion of how quickly I can shift to manic irritability when people don't understand what I'm saying, or they don't understand it as quickly as I'd like. That is something that, has indicated to me that it can very quickly kind of sneak into a dangerous place. And for people listening, they might say, like, why would you want to get rid of that? So what would be your response? Why would you want to get rid of that?
Like, I think it's really easy to live with for a while until you start damaging relationships in ways that it's really hard to walk back. You can only apologize so many times for similar behavior before people really start to question whether or not you mean it, and whether or not, like, apologies really have to come with a change of behavior. And I will say too that I've, gone through periods where I've been off my meds because, as I alluded to, I think especially during lockdown, it was so funny because I was convinced that the medication was the reason I wasn't able to write during lockdown. Meanwhile, I was locked down alone in my house for a year. And I was like, certainly that couldn't be the reason I'm struggling to be creative right now. It has to be my antipsychotic medication that's making me this way. So I've gone through periods where I've been off of it, and I've gone through periods where I've been on it. And especially now that I've been in a relationship for a year and a half, and he's seen me in periods where I've been on it and off of it, I think like it's a real close-up picture of the ways in which my hypomania, whereas like before when I was single and living alone, I could really contain it to certain spheres of my life. Like really only, airline employees were privy to the measure of how quickly I could swing between pleasant and unpleasant.
I'm sorry to laugh, but I think we're the same person.
Yeah. And it wasn't until I had this person in my life who was experiencing these swings very, very up close and personal that I understood just how minute some of the changes can be when I'm off medication versus on it, and how impactful those changes can be. And so for I medicate because I want to be in control of my life and my emotions and my reactions to things. But I won't lie, like having him in my life really does. It's a stabilizing presence because I have this person sort of who is a barometer for my emotions at all times, and it's difficult, but it is something that I'm really glad that I've landed on and am able to put a name to, and I don't want to be a horrible person to airline employees, but so that's sort of where I'm at with that.
That's really, really well said. And I did want to touch on one more thing before we move on from this, but I really appreciate your honesty about this. And you're so articulate, in describing a very hard to understand, kind of set of fluctuations, which for some of us are just our norm, it's sort of our norm. But when you mentioned that, you hadn't really lived a lot in the depression, hadn't really kind of focused a lot on that, one of the things that people, that lay people often say about comedians is like, oh, they're all a mess, like they're all depressed, blah, blah, blah. But when you started kind of describing, what you were able to achieve, kind of in that hypomanic state, and either the boldness or the creativity or whatever. In some ways, I kind of wonder, and I'm not trying to pathologize you, but in some ways I wonder if part of that, was masking, kind of this deeper set of emotions that many comedians experience. And you talk specifically also about, kind of like the depiction of Asian men, for example, or, Asians in comedy, and how that sort of chips away at a lot of aspects of yourself. And I wonder if kind of that sort of conglomerate, of self-criticism or, what can spiral into depression in many ways got sort of hidden by the ability you had to transform it. Does that make sense?
No, absolutely. And I think it really does, because I definitely experienced a lot of the same emotions that I was experiencing during lockdown, but my life was moving so fast that it was really easy to just sort of speed past those emotions and ignore them, and then cover them with, all of the things that I would always usually know that a bout of hypomania was coming if I was experiencing them. And I was like, okay, it's just got to push through to win the eureka moment, which is what I probably, how I really saw my hypomanic states for a long time would come. And I just had to push through to that moment. And it wasn't until the pandemic when I was alone and quite honestly alone, and then really living most of my social life online in deeply toxic places like Twitter, that I really found myself. And then, I should say too, my dad passed away in March of 2021. And that was another big thing that really dragged me down into, experiencing this depression on a really visceral level for the first time. And so that was really difficult. I think like I don't think I've ever been lower than like probably April, May of 2021. It was a really, really dark time. And that was, again, another reason why I realized I really needed to stay on top of my treatment in that period.
I'm very sorry for your loss. And, COVID was such a mess on a global level, such a mess on a countrywide level. And, when you hear of individual loss, we forget that besides the whole mess of everything going on, there also was personal grief. And so I'm very, very sorry. Although I agree that Twitter, Twitter already was an increasingly toxic space, and many of us have chosen to no longer hide that. But there is a quote that you posted that I really want to mention, and then I have a couple other things I want to ask you about. I just the way you put words together is really, it's marvelous. You said, mentally ill people don't owe the world informed normalcy to disabuse you of whatever notions you may have formed about us based on anecdotal experience with a celeb's online presence. And I love this quote so much for so many reasons. I didn't talk about my challenges, for most of my life. And it was people like Will Wheaton and Grace Helbig who really inspired me in this space. There's also something about not being a white male in the space that I think is special, meaning there's something about, when a white male says he's suffering from something that has a different response than if someone who's not a white male says it. And I have total respect for white men. I know many of them. I interact with many of them. I love humans. But, to be a person who already is, either a person of color, a woman, a person in an underserved population, when those kind of arenas speak up about mental illness, it is different. I always fear people are going to make more assumptions about women if I say anything, or they're going to make more assumptions about Jews if I say anything, or they'll make more assumptions about celebrities, or, just like fill in the blank. And we're all doing this as humans, whether there's Twitter or not, whether we're celebrities or not. We're all concerned with what other people think. But for some of us, it does weigh more heavily because of our chemistry and our sensitivity or whatever. But this notion of, where we choose to share or where we don't, and sort of what the purpose is. And also, it's often not enough for people. They want more of it, or they want, the gritty details. And so whenever Jonathan and I speak to people, I try and make clear that I'm not looking for dirt. I'm looking for whatever someone is comfortable sharing. But I wonder, sort of with that quote, mentally ill people don't owe the world informed normalcy to disabuse you of whatever notions you may have formed about us based on anecdotal experience with a celeb's online presence. So many celebrities post things about their mental health status now and their gender identity and everything. What's your feeling about sort of the publicness of what you experience?
I mean, it's definitely, for me, I used to live very much online. Like there was a lot of, and I think a lot of my online brand was really built around radical transparency. Like I was an oversharer. I was an early adopter of being an oversharer on social media. And that felt really radical. Like I said, at the time, to be sharing, these windows into my very personal parts of my life, my sex life, my dating life, my family life, like all of those things, I think really helped me garner a lot of the following that I have, because people found that to be really interesting at the time. And then it turns into this thing where, because I'm telling people, like, the lie is you're seeing 90% of who I am as a person right now, when in fact it was always just 15%, but because I was selling it as radical transparency and my entire life is an open book for you, I think people began to expect a lot of different things, or they had this idea that they knew who I was on a really deep level when in fact they didn't. And so it's one of those things where I just needed to walk it back in order to regain control of my own narrative, you know? And especially as I think like a mentally ill person, it was really scary because you are so used to having yourself already, everything I was doing was being pathologized as like anything I did was like, oh, that's a gay guy thing, or that's an Asian guy thing, or et cetera, et cetera. And I was so worried that like now being public about this, everything I would do would be colored by this lens of mental illness too. And that was, I just didn't want that to be, I didn't want to step into becoming like a spokesperson basically, and or some sort of model of what mental disease looked like. I just wanted to be honest and be me, in as much as I could be. And I've really taken a step back from social media just because it is the most stressful, biggest stressor I think on my mental health.
There's something you talk about being Asian, that I think also, you know, in with the proscenium of you kind of, you know, not really thinking that much about being Asian, right? Meaning, you know, you were part of your family. You were part of your family, and you know, assumed that maybe every family had an Asian child in it. I mean, the example I think that you used was on, you know, on dating apps, no Asians.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's something we typically don't talk a lot about, and I'm really glad that you do speak about this, because I think especially it's kind of, I don't mean to sound like a total hippie, but it's like, what is race anyway? You know, like what, like we have all these words and we have all these terms, and you hail from a genetic, you know, mother and a genetic father, and you know, we're brought to this country, you know, and raised in a family that was very different from the family that you would have been raised in, you know, and so this is where also, especially for Jewish people like myself who are not Jews of color, you know, this is what it means to have white privilege. You know, this is what it means to be able to say, I can go on a dating app, and for the most part, I mean, I might be an exception because I do have very prominent features. I'm like a, you know, perfect Eastern European mutt. But this is fascinating to me, you know, and I think your quote was, we're never being sent subliminal messages that you're attractive, you know, if you're an Asian person in the media. And, you know, I grew up with, you know, 16 Candles being one example of one of the most well-known, you know, kind of egregious, complicated depictions of an Asian person in you know, mainstream media, as it were, at that time, which was completely not upsetting, meaning it is upsetting. And at the time, I mean, so many things about our culture just sort of fed into this notion that we kind of didn't talk about. It's kind of like, oh, we're allowed to do this. And the attractiveness thing, I think, is so interesting to me. Because also, you know, historically, white people have a very specific sense of what's attractive. And it's really only when I started to meet, in particularly men, you know, from other ethnic backgrounds or from other races, where I was like, oh, not everyone wants to date Pamela Anderson, you know, because I was raised to believe that there's only one way to be attractive, you know?
Yeah.
So can you speak a little bit to that? And I also know that there's probably so much complexity as, you know, as a gay person, because there's also a whole different set, you know, of culture, you know, surrounding that.
For me, it's largely connected to this idea, I think for both heterosexual Asian men and gay Asian men, that attractiveness in Western society is largely connected to masculinity. And there's a lot of sort of emasculation that goes on in popular culture around Asian men. And then that becomes even more difficult for me to sort of parse out and navigate, because I am not someone like, there's a lot of toxicity surrounding masculinity within the gay community just in general. And so it's one of these things where it's like, I don't want to be thinking about how I am acting and how it's affecting the image of all Asian men all the time, because I just want to be me. And who I am is someone who is quite stereotypically gay, and I feel like I'm selling out. I don't want to feel like I'm selling out my entire race by just having the interests that I have and being the person that I am. And yet I do feel that pressure. And that is one of the things that I think it's really funny. We're in this place in culturally around race where for the first time in a long ever, white people are starting to have their behavior pathologized in a joking way to the rest of their race. I think a good example of this is that like white people don't season their food is like something that is like a trope that you're seeing. And you're seeing white people really respond to this being like, hey, that I don't like this feeling. But the fact is that like there is no amount of saying white people don't season their food that will actually impact the white community as a whole.
I was
Because
going to say people are so outraged. Like, you're saying our food doesn't have flavor. How about your entire existence as a people being questioned based on literally what your skin looks like?
Yeah. And so it is funny that like white people have had to deal with these jokes now for a couple of decades, maybe at most.
We're really struggling, okay?
Yeah.
It's really hard.
Whereas we're sort of up against a century of these messages and these ideas around who we are as people based on our race that are really hard to dismantle. Like I would love to be able to just be able to think about or not think about these triangulations of my various identities every time I step out on stage or every time I, do anything pretty much in the public eye, because I'm worried about how that is reflected on the rest of my identities. And it's a constant I'm doing the calculus of it all constantly, and I don't think that we realize that. I know a lot of people who are doing this where it's like, okay, I want to do this as an Asian man, I want to appear this way, but if I appear this way, then as a gay person that'll look weird and
Right.
different, and having to go through those thoughts, it takes its toll emotionally and it's exhausting, and I don't think that like we sort of address how that the mental exhaustion that people of color and people of different identities, that labor that we have to go through every day to try and like stay ahead of people's assumptions about us.
So well said. And I don't mean to ask you this, but I want to. What do you think it means to be stereotypically gay? Like, what is it for you? I'm not asking you to speak for all, gay men or gay women, but what does that mean to you?
I think it's for me, it's about, there's a certain level of freedom that we have in the way we express ourselves that straight men aren't afforded. So this is a positive almost, where I think if straight men acted a little bit more gay, they'd feel a little bit freer, because we have access to a wider range of being in a lot of ways than straight men are allowed to have in the culture. And I think it comes down to a lot of like interests and sort of ways of being. Like, I think, I idolize women. And I always looked to strong female figures of empowerment and related to those women for some reason that is a mystery, I think, to me even now. And I think those are sort of the two big ones that I think you can sort of connect many different stereotypes about the gay community to those two areas of interest and sort of see how they were birthed from just our ability. And because once you come out as gay, you are suddenly now, there's all these expectations thrust on you of how you're going to be or who you're going to be, that can be at once very oppressive and frustrating, and at the same time like very freeing. For me, it feels very freeing to just not have to be where the expectation isn't that I'm going to be this like ideal masculine figure in the world that is, has to go out and do a certain set of very specific things to be an ideal straight man. I don't have to deal with that anymore. And I think for some people that's really scary, but for me, it was really freeing to just have those expectations lessened a little bit.
Would you ever play a straight man?
Yeah, I have, in fact. there's a lot of characters that I've played where the sexuality isn't specified that I probably have conceived of them as gay just because I can. But I have played straight men in the past, and I would again. I think the question of like, will people be able to suspend their disbelief enough to get past that because I am so publicly gay is the question. And that's why it's frustrating with regard really quickly to like casting straight actors in gay roles. I don't actually find anything morally wrong with a straight actor playing a gay role, especially if they're good at it, then that's fine. What I find frustrating is that we are so often locked out of getting cast in those roles, and then also locked out of getting cast as straight people because people can't suspend their disbelief for us. They don't extend that suspension of disbelief for us. Whereas it's very comfortable for them to watch a straight person play gay because in the back of their mind, they're like, oh, that's a person acting versus, and that's why it's more for me an economical thing of, if we are getting locked out of playing gay roles, but also not allowed to be called in for straight roles, then like that's the problem. It's more of an economical issue for me than it is a moral one.
I think especially with where our culture is moving in understanding gender, as a spectrum, as a fluid spectrum, my assumption now is that everyone is on some part of that spectrum, and at any moment someone could come out, they could feel different, maybe they don't want to announce it. I'm just good with like everybody living their best life and me not thinking as much about who they're having sex with. It's not my business anyway. You know what I mean? Sorry, this is a weird question, but I'm going to ask it. I wonder if you experience any sort of fetishization of Korean culture, in particular South Korean film and cinema. There's been, so much, and obviously Parasite was hugely, hugely monumental, not only for Korea, but for the world and for our industry. But, my boys and I, we just finished Squid Game. I had watched it alone, and we just watched it together. And my older son also has seen Parasite and was so fascinated with the filmmaking, which is masterful. And I believe Squid Game, follows a lot of similar, kind of tropes in terms of cinema. And in addition, we happen to do Taekwondo. And so we have a limited Korean vocabulary, but that is, a martial art. And so we've been able to identify, words that we knew only in our studio are in movies. They're in television. We're recognizing words. I'm curious, especially because, you talk about not growing up with this notion of like, I am South Korean. I wonder, how that feels to you. I mean, I don't want to put anything on you, but that is, in theory, that's where you were born, and it is, the culture that you came from and that your ancestors came from.
It's funny. I've always been I have a lot of pride about being Asian American. And that extends to pride about being Korean American specifically. But it's always because of, I didn't culturally grow up Korean. It's always been sort of difficult. I always sort of wonder how much I'm allowed to own any of that, Like I've always felt much closer to being like, and I identify as Asian American before I identify as Korean American because I don't have the specifics of the culture ingrained in me. I didn't grow up with them. And so it's always been interesting to me because what is Asian American culture? Like what is the culture that we have created for ourselves as immigrants and otherwise in this country as a racial group? I think there's a less clear idea of that than there are for our specific diasporas, like, and I think it gets sort of muddied, the conversation, because so many things, many white people or Americans in general of any race don't understand are connected to specific countries or cultures within Asia.
What, you mean
like growing up,
Pan-Asian cuisine isn't a thing?
Yeah, like growing up, like, if someone was doing karate, if anime, anything, they were like, that's Joel's because he's Asian. And it wasn't until I grew up later that I was like, oh, no. Anime is actually specifically Japanese. Karate is not a Korean martial art.
No.
There are actual like deviations and quite specific cultural, sort of signifiers within each of these countries and cultures. And it's not all just Asia,
Not to mention that South Asia is part of Asia, but most people don't think of Indians and then Malaysians and Balinese people, like, it's very, yeah, but that's also just like the US, like we barely know where Canada is,
Yeah.
I want to touch on just a couple other projects of yours. I know we spent a lot of time talking about PsychoSexual. You also play Nicholas, Maya Rudolph's quirky assistant on Loot, which is on Apple TV Plus. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
And how long have you been doing that?
Just a little over a year now, actually. We started shooting the first season of Loot in September of last year, and we're going to start shooting the second season in January of 2023. So a little over a year now we've been doing that project, and that's obviously really exciting because Maya Rudolph is a legend and an icon.
She's phenomenal.
And is one of the loveliest people and humans that I've had the privilege of working with. Like, frequently leaves set because she has to go and take her kids to soccer practice. Like, is that real of a human being? Which is so nice it was so nice to learn, because you never know with celebrities of that caliber, how much they're actually living a real life outside of their work. And it was just always nice to learn that she still very much cared about being a mom before being an actor, which is it's encouraging, because I don't know, I want to have kids someday, and I would like to think that would be how I would operate as well.
And also wanted to give a special shout out to Fire Island, which you wrote.
Mm-hmm.
The premise is a group of queer best friends gather in Fire Island Pines for their annual week of love and laughter, but a sudden change of events might make this their last summer in gay paradise. And I mean, Margaret Cho is in it, who I'm obsessed with, and Bowen Yang. It is a twist on Pride and Prejudice, correct?
Yeah, it is loosely based on the plot of Pride and Prejudice.
This happens to be an appropriate thing to talk about because I just went to a Jane Austen improv Christmas special where the entire improv troupe has to improvise in the style of Jane Austen, whatever, and they do a long form. Anyway, so I'm definitely in a Jane Austen kind of holiday mood right now. But was this something, is that how you really conceived of this?
Yeah, it's funny. I brought Pride and Prejudice to read with me the first time I ever went to Fire Island in 2015 or 2016. I can't remember which. And I grew up watching the BBC miniseries with my mom. I love the Keira Knightley version as well. And I had never really read the book before. And so I brought it with me and I was reading it there. And it really it sort of blew my mind how relevant many of her observations about class, and specifically the ways in which people sort of communicate across class lines, felt to me in that moment in the mid 2010s, just on Fire Island. I was like, wow, these are the ways in which we're communicating here on this island as well. And it started as a joke. I say it started jokingly, it started as a threat. I sort of offhandedly said, wouldn't it be funny if I made an all-gay Pride and Prejudice set on Fire Island? And everyone was sort of like, that's a dumb idea, don't do that. Because on paper, it does not sound very good. And it just was an idea. I kept bringing Jane Austen books back with me every year that we would go to Fire Island. And I would read them and just again, continually come back to how prescient she was as a writer, and just how incisive she was about the ways people act. And, I wrote a version of the script on spec without it, basically meaning I wrote it on my free time and then tried to sell it. Nobody wanted it. And then, Quibi happened. And Quibi, for those of you who don't know, was a very short-lived short-form streaming platform that then, bought the project and then folded shortly after, and we were able to take it to Hulu, who produced it, which was really really shocking to me that it actually made it through the many layers of development that you have to go through, and then to get something greenlit.
Really incredible. Well, I have to say, I'm assuming your parents did an excellent job of homeschooling you, because your vocabulary, the way you speak, and the way your brain works is really, really magnificent, and just such a breath of fresh air. We have a really, really nutso crazy industry, and I am just so grateful for talents like you who are really owning the space so authentically. I think you're phenomenal, and it's just been such a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you so much, Mayim. It was really, really lovely to be here.
Also, I completely am wearing a yin yang sweatshirt. I just need everyone to know I didn't know
I didn't think about it. It was a gift. I just hate myself.
Didn't even notice.
Oh
But
my
now it's the
goodness.
only thing I'm taking away from this interview.
Since I'm by myself, I have so many things I would want to talk to Jonathan about. But suffice it to say, I really, really enjoyed that interview. As many of you know, I really am a connoisseur of all things stand-up, and I was just so blown away by his special. I do recommend it very, very highly, and I hope that after hearing just how intelligent and insightful and reflective this man is, I hope you will check out the special, because it really is such a beautifully crafted bit of comedy. And highly recommend Fire Island as well, which you can get on Hulu, and Loot on Apple TV Plus. I don't know that we've had a guest talk in that depth about specifically bipolar 2, what it's like to have hypomania and not kind of full-blown mania as your primary kind of feature of bipolar disorder. And I just thought the way he described it was just so fascinating and human, and I love that he's comfortable with medication. I know a lot of people want to do things other ways, and his life may change in ways that may make him do other things as well, but I just really am impressed with him so much. And it's just, I said refreshing. I hate when people use that word, but I just went ahead and used it because it's really refreshing to meet someone who is so funny. Like also so like he's viciously funny. Like he's not like a delicate comedian. He's so funny and he's so bright and just so self-aware. What a story. I'm just really fascinated with what he's going to do next. You know, I cannot wait to see what else he creates. And follow us on Instagram if you don't already. And from my breakdown to the one I hope you never have, I'll see you next time.
It's Mayim Bialik's breakdown. She's gonna break it down for you. She's got a neuroscience PhD or two. One fiction, and now she's gonna break down